Hello, team. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm going solo. Haven't done a solo episode in a while. And I thought it's time to talk about something that I really enjoy talking about today, which is programming. Specifically within programming. I think this is going to kickstart a bit of a series actually. So today's going to be talking about the concept of periodization. Which essentially, I'll explain what that is in a little bit, taking more of a macro view at training, different types of periodization, things that I've experimented with in the past, and kind of the style of periodization that I typically use now with pretty much all of my athletes, regardless of kind of what their goals are. A bit of background, what's going on in Hong Kong right now? Well, we're in our third round, I should say, of business closure. We've been closed for 3 weeks now, unfortunately, as cases are higher than the government would like. They're still relatively low. We're only getting about 40 to 50 cases a day, but it is what it is. We've been closed for 3 weeks and we've just been told we're going to close for another 2 weeks. So I'm sat at home here on a Thursday because we've asked all of our team to take a day off on Thursdays. And so, yeah, here I am on my Jack Jones about to record a podcast for you all. Let's get into it. We're talking about periodization today. Well, what is periodization? Periodization is essentially taking a macro view at your training and trying to create some form of organized, systematic way at which you approach your training. So typically, how we look at it is you could take something like a 1 month or a 3 month, a 6 month, a 1 year, maybe a 5 year view of your training, working back from the goal that you're striving towards, or perhaps you don't even have a goal, but essentially working back from your goal and creating buckets of time where you are focusing on specific things with your training. So if you were to take an Olympic athlete, for example, their macro view of training would look like a 4-year training cycle where they're trying to peak their athletes to be in the best possible condition when the Olympics rolls around. For someone who has the goal of being as lean as possible before they go on their summer holiday, and it's now January, the macro view would be more like a 6-month view of training where you're trying to organize their training to ensure they are looking as ripped and shredded by the time they get on that plane on the way to their holiday. If we're talking about CrossFit, and as you all know, I work a lot with CrossFit athletes, periodization really is you're looking at the entire season. So from when a season finishes to when they need to be peaking in the next season. And for most folks in the CrossFit space, that is coming up in March this year, hopefully, fingers crossed, whereby those who have an interest in competing in the sport of CrossFit will be taking part in the 2021 CrossFit Open. So for a lot of the athletes and the groups that I work with or program for, the periodization process really started, almost over a year ago when the last season finished. So yeah, it's all coming to fruition now. Let's quickly define the different types of periodization and what those things are. So probably the most classical form of periodization would be linear periodization. Linear periodization typically, and this was popularized by a lot of the Russian strength coaches, is where in a year or within a training cycle, I should say, you're going through a period of time where perhaps you're focusing on endurance, and then from endurance you're moving to strength or strength endurance, and then you're moving to absolute strength, then you're moving into power, and then you're kind of repeating that cycle over and over again. So it was a very classic form of periodization that a lot of folks would use with, even general population folks, but also specifically athletes within a season. The next form of periodization would then be something that's a little bit less linear, and that would be called non-linear periodization, or some call it undulated periodization. And that's typically where you're working on all the different facets of the strength continuum, the conditioning continuum at the same time. So it's a little bit more jumbled. You kind of as each training phase comes along, you're changing the priorities of that training phase. You could be kind of training strength, endurance, power, all at the same time in a somewhat of a structured way. And that is actually something that I tend to use a lot when it comes to periodization for my clients. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we've got linear periodization, we've got non-linear periodization, and another one is we have block periodization. Block periodization typically is where you're kind of setting out anywhere between the 2 to 6 week training phase, for example. And within that 2 to 6 week training phase, you're going through a period of accumulation, and then the next period would be a little bit more intense, and then you'd kind of have like a peaking phase within that small block. Something I've definitely experimented with in the past, but don't use all that much. Or in fact, kind of combine the concept of block periodization with more of an undulated non-linear periodization model. So those are your 3 typical types of periodization that coaches will use, or even in CrossFit standards, you think about the typical whiteboard, the athletes gathering right around the whiteboard and writing down their workout for the day. Pretty much every form of training that folks will do will fit within one of these 3 buckets. And if you're saying, well, I don't even periodize my training, it's completely random, well then that actually kind of sits within the undulated non-linear periodization model. Periodization is actually a really important thing, I think, in terms of long-term success and short-term success in pretty much folks in all walks of life. It just creates structure, it creates priorities, which essentially is going to hopefully, if done correctly, yield more results with your training. Kind of looking back at my experience as a coach, when I kind of talk about these 3 things, I have very profound memories within each of these 3 different types of training. Thinking back firstly to a rugby player, we had a really good strength and conditioning coach who would write all of our training designs, and they weren't individualized, but if you were in the backs and you're an outside back, you'd have your own program, which would probably be a little bit more catered towards speed and power. If you were more of kind of in the playmaking role, like a 10 or 9 or a center, which is where I played, you kind of have a mixture of everything. If you're in the forwards, if you're a tight forward, you'd have a different program from the loose forwards, and so on and so forth. And so, the main type of periodization that I was exposed to at first was very much a linear style of periodization, where in the start of the season, you'd be going through more of an endurance hypertrophy training block, where you're doing generally lighter loads and more repetitions. And then kind of as the season went on, you got closer to playing or actually being in the season, your training focus would change a little bit, and you just kind of repeat that year after year. When I first started learning about periodization as a coach, it was under Charles Poliquin, and the PICP method was probably the first exposure I got to periodization. My coach of the Hong Kong national rugby team was also a certified PICP coach, so a lot of his training programs were very much influenced by Charles Poliquin and his styles, and again, like I said, very much a linear style of periodization. And so when I first got into coaching and personal training, and I was writing programs for my friends, my family, but also my clients when I started Coastal Fitness, was very much adopting the linear periodization style. So really bucketing periods of time to chasing a certain adaptation with our training. I obviously have experimented and predominantly now use undulated and non-linear styles of periodization, whereby we're trying to address many different things at the same time. It can definitely be a little bit more chaotic. It can definitely be more overwhelming if you're someone a little bit less experienced with programming and periodization, because there could just be so much going on. And if you try to wing it and not prep with an undulated non-linear style of periodization, it can be very overwhelming, very confusing, and you can very quickly lose track of what you're trying to achieve with a program. And then, the last one, which is block periodization, I've definitely experimented with this one as well, which is within a training block, having periods of lower intensity, more volume, and then kind of ramping up intensity throughout that training program. I've definitely used that a lot with more body composition style clients, not so much within the sport of CrossFit, because it's just a lot harder to apply to that, and I'll definitely talk about that a little bit later. What I will say is that when it comes to periodization, there is definitely no right or wrong. All forms of periodization could be very successful in their own right, but it's really important that you, as an athlete, as a person who's programming for yourself, or as a coach, have clarity and, of course, what you're trying to achieve with the program. and therefore structuring your thoughts and the periodization program appropriately. And the more clarity you can have going into that process, the easier it all becomes. So typically these days, most of the folks that I'm working with are within the CrossFit space. With that said, I do work with athletes who play sports like rugby, tennis, trail running, ultramarathon type events, triathlons, Ironmen. And so, I do definitely implement a variety of different forms of periodization, but predominantly for me, I spend most of my time using the undulated or the non-linear style of periodization. And so why I kind of like to use that as a method? Well, when I first got into programming for the sport of CrossFit, I definitely started with linear periodization, which is, where we would essentially go through a big period of training, just focusing on, let's say, strength endurance with our lifting. And then after a certain amount of time, move into more of a strength phase. And whilst that's okay, and it can be effective, specifically it can be really effective for beginners or people a little bit newer to CrossFit and strength conditioning. The thing is to remember in CrossFit, we're actually trying to get people better at everything. So essentially adopting a linear style of periodization to the sport of CrossFit means that yes, in a training period where you're focusing on one thing, you can get that thing to be really good, whatever that adaptation you're chasing is. But essentially by moving away from it and shifting the priorities to something else, essentially that thing that you work so hard on developing, which might be beneficial for the sport, is now going to start to deteriorate. And what we want, we're trying to build an athlete who's generally good across the board. Now, where linear style periodization might actually work is in something like an off season where you have very specific goals. Let's say it's to try and get someone stronger. You may actually adopt and use that type of training kind of in an off season window. But generally speaking, when you're looking at more of a macro view, looking at the entire year, the undulated model is something I tend to favor. Now, it can be really hard, and I know when I speak to a lot of other coaches who are kind of getting into programming for the first time, especially getting into the sport of CrossFit, where there are thousands, if not more, different things we're trying to get our athletes better at. They find it really overwhelming trying to create a system which is organized and makes sense and is communicatable so that we can actually, translate our ideas to our clients so they kind of get buy-in and they understand what they're doing. And it definitely can be overwhelming. And, it's taken me a really long time. I've been programming for the sport now for a good part of 8 years. And, it's only until more recent times I've really started to grasp or kind of create my own system as to how I go about programming for the sport of CrossFit. So typically, what we do is that the sport of CrossFit, the way that I'll typically go about programming is that we go from it's about kind of, addressing the lowest hanging fruit. So there is, the word I'm looking for is a limitation-based model approach. So basically what we're meaning by that is you're looking at all the different things that someone needs in order to be good at the sport of CrossFit. Now, good at the sport of CrossFit is obviously context specific. If you have someone who's only been in the sport for 2 years, what they need to be competitive within the sport relative to their peers and their competitors is very different to someone who's trying to get to the CrossFit Games. Right, but typically, the whole approach there is that we're looking at statistical data as to, okay, well, if someone needs to be at the CrossFit Games, what do they need to be able to do in each of the components? So for example, within absolute strength and squatting, what is the average statistics of a male squat, or a snatch, or a 2K row, or how long can they walk on their hands unbroken, or what is their Fran time? When basically as a coach, we're collecting all the statistics that we need our athletes, or that we use as a baseline for our athletes to be able to achieve. And then we simply look at the statistics of our athlete and say, okay, well, given the statistics of the sport and where you need to be relative to your goals, what is the lowest hanging fruit? What is the thing that's limiting you? What is the thing that's holding you back from progressing forward? And essentially what we're trying to do is establish what that one thing is, or what those things are that's holding that athlete back, the things that are less competitive relative to the other things they're able to do, and basically focus on improving those things and bringing them up to an average level. And of course, when you bring it up and now you have all your different strength and endurance qualities at the same level, then it's just about chipping away at the next thing. Okay, well, what do we target next? And then, spend some time addressing that while the other things go on maintenance. And then you're just simply ticking boxes, and over time kind of repeating this cycle until that athlete has all of their different strength and endurance adaptations up to a suitable level. So, of course, that system sounds easy, sounds like it makes sense. A really important concept to understand here is that when we're striving for adaptation, the mistake that a lot of folks make when they start is that they try to improve everything at the same time. So, they identify 50 things that they need to improve at, and they basically try to cram those 50 things into their week of training. And of course, what ends up happening is that the rate of progression on each of those things is really, really small and really, really slow. And what ends up happening is that after a short amount of time, when they've finished and they've exhausted their newbie gains, they're no longer progressing within the sport, and they're wondering why. So typically our approach is that we pick those few things, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 things, and we really kind of go, not all in necessarily, but we really focus our time and energy on improving those things. Now, it's really important to understand that within the sport of CrossFit, you don't necessarily want to stop doing the other things as well, because there is just so many things to get good at. If you just stop the other things and don't touch them at all, then you're going to end up having another problem whereby, yes, you address these 4 or 5 things, but the other things then need addressing after that. So it's more of a case of prioritize a few things and put everything else on maintenance. And then we kind of just flip and flop between those 2 things, and slowly we're bringing everything up. Now, of course, the movements or the things that the athlete is really good at, perhaps you don't need to touch on those things as much. Maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks might be enough for that person to maintain the strength or the capacity or the skill of that thing. If it's less of a strength, then maybe you need more frequent touches on it. So, that's essentially the concept of undulated or non-linear periodization that will apply to the sport of CrossFit. And so I thought I'd just quickly share kind of how I would then go about creating a plan or a program for a client within the sport of CrossFit specifically. And I think I'll also give some examples inside how I kind of go about that in fact, we'll start here, how I go about that for, just a general population client. So let's define that general population client first. It's someone who isn't necessarily competing for a sport. I don't necessarily have any tangible goals like looking leaner or getting a 6-pack or growing their biceps to a certain size. They just want to generally be fit, healthy, strong, have good markers of health, feel energized, sleep well, develop relationships with their friends and loved ones. So then what type of periodization model will we use? Well, again, we can use all of them, of course. They'd all work in their own unique ways, and you don't really have set goals and timelines to work with, or the confines of requirements of a sport to work with. But let's say we're going to use that undulated non-linear periodization model. So basically we want to try and work on all things at the same time. Well, the same kind of system applies to the body comp or the general health client that I would use for the CrossFit client. Rather than using statistics of the sport to dictate what their weaknesses are or what their priorities are, we're going to firstly start with a comprehensive and holistic assessment. That assessment is going to take into account everything, not just their strength or their capacity within the gym and exercise. We're also going to look at things like nutrition, sleep, stress management, perhaps if they have access to blood markers and clinical tests, we'll use those as well. And essentially, after you look at all those things, okay, well, what is the lowest hanging fruit that we need to address with this person? It might actually be sleep, in which case we're going to invest in mindfulness and sleep routines. It may be that all those things are in check, and we just really need to focus on the training side of things. So let's just talk about this training side of things. Otherwise, I'll end up talking about this person for hours and hours and hours, and we'll get away from the point of this podcast. But let's say we're talking about training, how do we create a system, or how do we create structure to go about creating priorities for someone who doesn't necessarily have any goals? Well, something that I often fall back on and use is structural ratios. So structural ratios was something created by, I think initially Charles Poliquin was one of the very first people to start thinking about this. And that was obviously adapted and developed further by companies like OPEX, previously called OPT. And essentially what they did was they took different forms of movement, for example, a squat, a deadlift, bench press, an overhead press, a pull-up, and basically created based on what they believe, and this is obviously curated from many, many years of research and data, to be a structurally balanced individual. For example, your push should be fairly balanced with your pull. You know, your back squat should be a percentage of your deadlift, your front squat should be a percentage of your back squat, and so on and so forth. And so what I quite like to do with folks who don't necessarily have any performance goals is, well, okay, this person's looking for general health. Let's try and get them as structurally balanced as possible. And so, you know, of course, an assessment process needs to take place, and then we identify, you know, of the different planes of movements or the different muscle groups, which areas are they typically lacking in? And, you know, rarely do I meet someone who is perfectly structurally balanced. It just really doesn't happen that much. And basically we'll design a training program around the priorities that they need as an athlete or as a person, with the goal of trying to get them as structurally balanced as possible. So for example, if someone has a very strong deadlift, let's say they can deadlift 100 kilograms for argument's sake, you know, structural ratios tell us that a deadlift should be roughly about 125% of a back squat if we were to use, let's say, 1 rep maxes here. But let's say in this case, the athlete's deadlift is 175% of their back squat, so way, way stronger, which might indicate that there is a posterior chain bias in their strength relative to anterior chain. You know, we're going to forget about things like technique. We're going to forget about things like movement patterns. We're going to assume this person is technically proficient with everything and they don't have any movement compensations. So in which case, in this example, we would look to create a bias in the training towards improving their squatting strength. And knowing that, you know, if we can increase their squatting strength, we're probably also going to be increasing the strength of the anterior part of their body, specifically their lower body, like their quads, hip flexors and trunk. And over time, that's going to make them more structurally balanced, which is going to help reduce the risk against injury, and so on and so forth. So how we organize that into their training? Okay, well, now we're going to specifically focus on driving up their squatting strength or strength endurance, whatever it is that we're chasing. And then after a period of time, we're simply reassessing. So, you know, in that training phase, they're going to be doing more squatting, perhaps 2 times a week. And we're just going to be doing some maintenance work on their hinging, because we never really want to make a strong muscle weak. That's never really the objective with training. Instead, keep strong muscles strong, but make weak muscles stronger. And, you know, when we get to a point where we feel, okay, we brought the squat up to a level which is, you know, more or less balanced, or getting close enough to being balanced with their hinge, okay, now we can just simply work on the next priority. And, you know, when essentially you get to the point where that athlete is now structurally balanced and they don't have anything that is glaring as a weakness or an imbalance, okay, cool. Well, now you have the pick of the choice. As a coach, you can kind of just pick anything and we start moving on to the next chapter, or we start bringing their strength or the capacity up to a whole new level altogether. Let's talk about the CrossFit client. So obviously the concept, if you understood that, the concept is now very much the same. Only thing is, we're not using structural balance ratios to inform their training. We're now using the statistics within each and every component of the sport of CrossFit and using that to dictate where their athletes' priorities are. Now, you have to understand, and if you're in the sport of CrossFit, this is gonna make sense, but it's not as simple as what is their snatch relative to their clean and jerk. Whilst yes, those are 2 things we have statistical data on, remember the snatch is tested at heavy loads, at medium loads, at light loads, at all of those loads in low fatigue based settings, non-fatigue based settings, moderate fatigue based settings, high fatigue based settings. When you combine the snatch with a burpee, that's now a completely different adaptation that needs to take place, as is combining the snatch with a pull-up. And so the journey and the exploration as a coach and an athlete trying to find where your weaknesses are will honestly be going on forever and ever and ever. And of course, it's a dynamic model because as you're improving things, other things are getting worse. And so, that's part of the challenge of CrossFit, but it's also for me what really excites me about the sport of CrossFit. Predominantly in my early years as a coach, I really just worked with body composition clients or folks who are competing in a specific sport like rugby, where, very simple strength and conditioning programs would be yielding great returns on the field because I wasn't really looking after the actual on-field training. So the complexity and the mayhem of CrossFit is, I think, what makes it really, really exciting and what makes it really, really challenging, which is kind of why after I found it, I've stuck with it. And so, typically when it comes to programming for the CrossFit client, the first thing we have to take into account is, well, what time of year are we in right now? So at this point in time, we're 2 months out for the CrossFit Open. That means our training has to be very much biased towards prepping our athletes for the CrossFit Open. What does that mean? It means ensuring that they're getting enough exposure to what the sport looks like, the sport in this case being the CrossFit Open, and that's going to ensure that they're actually preparing adequately for what's going to come in 2 months' time. If we spend this amount of time now, 2 months before the Open, just working on isolated strength, just skill adaptations or movement work, whilst yes, fantastic, you'll make improvements in all those areas, it's probably not going to actually get them better at doing a 20-minute AMRAP of wall balls, bar muscle ups and double unders. So typically, within the sport, again, you've got to kind of I like to create a system, or I guess categories. And I guess one category might be weightlifting or Olympic lifting. One might be strength movements, that's your typical squats, your deadlifts, your presses. One might be gymnastics. One might be movement, assuming that an athlete probably does have some movement dysfunction in some area. Another area might be skill adaptation. So that might be things like double unders and box jumps and those kind of things. There's a skill adaptation or a skill element to it. And of course, the huge bucket could be something like endurance or capacity. And then basically within each of those kind of categories, for each period of time where we're starting a new training cycle, is just to then list the priorities that we want to focus on. Okay, so within weightlifting for the next 8 weeks, what is the lowest hanging fruit that we want to focus on at this point in the year? Okay, well, for the Open coming up in the context of right now, we want to be probably working on light to moderate loads where we're cycling a barbell. That means, either performing quick singles or doing touch and go repetitions. That's going to be the main bulk of our snatching and clean and jerk work. We also, within kind of the strength movements, well, this is a tough one because in previous years, previous CrossFit events, they tested the CrossFit total, a back squat 1 rep max, a press 1 rep max, and a deadlift 1 rep max. So, if you're a guessing man or woman, you would say, well, perhaps it's important that we actually do prioritize training absolute strength leading to this Open because they've tested those things a couple of times now, maybe they'll test it again. But generally speaking, based on past CrossFit Opens, that's not something that they test frequently, and therefore we're going to bring our back squat absolute strength, our deadlift absolute strength, and our overhead press absolute strength. We're going to put that on maintenance mode for now, and instead we're going to focus on doing fatigue-based squatting or fatigue-based deadlifting, or combining our deadlifting with handstand push-ups or handstand walking. And then we look at the gymnastics category, and this will be my last example, otherwise I'll be here forever. In the earlier stages of the year, you might be spending time, isolating the ring muscle up, doing reps for quality or breaking down the muscle up into pull-up variations and dip variations. But at this point in the year, you probably need to start exposing your athletes to stringing higher sets or higher numbers of repetitions together on the ring muscle ups. And of course, you need to be putting that ring muscle up into some form of a fatigue-based setting. Mixing it with every other element of the sport in as many different combinations as you can possibly do, because that's probably where we're going to see the muscle up tested. Rarely in the Open is it tested in isolation, like at the CrossFit Games where they'll test 30 muscle ups for time. We just don't typically see that in the Open. And basically you take this approach with all the different categories within the sport of CrossFit. And of course, when the season all ends, we just go right back to drawing board. We understand, okay, well now we have 9 months until we need to prep our athlete to be in the best condition possible. what now, if I look at all the statistics of my athlete relative to the statistics of where they want to be, what is now the lowest hanging fruit? And we simply just restart that training cycle or that process. So folks, that is essentially, just a thought bubble on periodization and programming. I hope that kind of made sense. If you're someone who is programming for groups, whether you're in the sport of CrossFit, you're in a CrossFit box, or you're doing programming online, or you're not even in the sport of CrossFit, but you do have group training, you can still apply the same concept to group training as well. Typically what I'll do is that you have to, hopefully you're collecting data on your athletes or your subscribers. We're really lucky here at Process Programming. We have, and Coastal Fitness, we have a really good athlete tracking software called What Up, which basically as a coach I can look at every single day, and it gives me the score of all my subscribers on every single part of the workout. And essentially what we're trying to do is create an avatar of our clients. So if you have multiple groups, or for argument's sake, let's say we just have one program that everyone follows, I basically am creating an avatar of that training group. So the avatar for, let's say, our compete program, and as a male, can snatch on average 185 pounds, they can back squat 150 kilograms, they can do 10 unbroken strict handstand push-ups, so on and so forth. And so essentially you're creating an avatar of your group, and then you simply just follow that same system that I already talked about. What is the lowest hanging fruit that this avatar needs at this point in the year relative to where we want this avatar to get to, and then you just create that training bias in their program. When you feel that weakness is no longer a weakness relative to other skills or adaptations, then we simply just move on to the next one. I think that's a good place to finish. I really like talking about this kind of stuff, guys, and I hope I was able to kind of get across my ideas on a podcast. Actually, it was quite challenging, but always enjoy the challenge. Hope you enjoy this podcast, and please let me know if you would like to hear more of this stuff in the future. Hope you've all had a fantastic start to the new year, team. Had some time off with friends, family, and loved ones, and are ready to rip into the new year. Have a great day.